The city of Messina, located on the northeastern coast of Sicily, Italy, was once a thriving metropolis known for its rich history, beautiful architecture, and vibrant culture. But on the morning of December 28, 1908, everything changed. What was once a bustling city full of life was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes in history, forever altering its fate. Messina had long been in a region known for seismic activity. It sits on the edge of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, making it prone to earthquakes. However, despite this knowledge, the city was not prepared for what was to come. The buildings were constructed with outdated methods and materials that weren't designed to withstand the force of such a powerful earthquake. Streets were narrow, and the infrastructure was old, making the city particularly vulnerable when disaster struck. The fact that most of the population was still asleep when the earthquake hit only worsened the situation, leaving people trapped in their homes and buildings before they even had a chance to react. The earthquake itself struck with devastating force at around 5:30 in the morning. It was a massive 7.1 magnitude quake, but the destruction was made worse by the location of its epicenter just off the coast of Sicily. Not only did the earthquake shake the ground with incredible intensity, but it also triggered a massive tsunami that slammed into the coastline, adding to the devastation. Buildings collapsed, fires broke out, and the streets were filled with dust and debris. People were thrown from their beds and entire neighborhoods were destroyed in seconds. It was an event of epic proportions, but what was even more tragic was how unprepared Messina was for such a disaster. The city had no established emergency protocols, and there were no systems in place to effectively warn the public or respond to such a catastrophic event. Many of the buildings that had once stood proudly in the city center were reduced to rubble, and the few buildings that remained standing were severely damaged. Communication systems were knocked out, and emergency services were unable to respond quickly, further complicating the rescue efforts. This lack of preparedness and poor building standards were major contributing factors to the staggering loss of life. It's estimated that over 70,000 people lost their lives in the earthquake, but the number of casualties could have been even higher if not for the incredible efforts of survivors and international rescue teams. The tragedy would forever be etched into the history of Italy and the world, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of disaster preparedness and the dangers posed by seismic activity in vulnerable areas. In the following parts, we'll dive deeper into the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the struggles of the survivors, and how the earthquake left its mark on both the city of Messina and the world as a whole. But for now, it's clear that the earthquake of December 28, 1908 not only shattered buildings, but also the lives of thousands of people, forever changing the course of history. As the dust began to settle after the devastating earthquake that struck Messina on December 28, 1908, the scale of the destruction became painfully clear. The once thriving city, full of historical landmarks and elegant architecture, was now nothing more than a pile of rubble. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map, and the few structures that managed to survive were severely damaged. Fires raged in the chaos, adding to the already overwhelming destruction. What was once a bustling city was now a war zone. The first hours after the quake were chaotic. With the city's infrastructure in ruins, communications were nearly impossible. There were no working telephones, no power lines, and no way to quickly coordinate rescue efforts. What made the situation even worse was that the survivors were left to fend for themselves, as no immediate help arrived from local authorities. Rescue teams were unable to access the most heavily affected areas due to the rubble blocking the narrow streets of the city, making it almost impossible to reach those who were trapped beneath the collapsed buildings. People were left stranded without medical assistance, with many injured, some unable to even move. Hospitals were overwhelmed and medical supplies were running low. Surgeons and doctors were forced to operate in makeshift hospitals, often under dire conditions. What made the situation even more tragic was the fact that so many of the city's emergency services were destroyed or non-functional. It was only after several hours that international aid began to arrive, but for many, it was too late. The city had been left to deal with the immediate aftermath on its own. At the same time, the tsunami that had been triggered by the earthquake caused additional chaos along the coast. The waves, which reached up to 3 meters in height, hit the city of Messina and the surrounding areas, further damaging the already fragile coastal structures and sweeping away entire buildings. The powerful waves caused more casualties, and many survivors who had initially escaped the earthquake found themselves caught in the deadly waves. The Italian government's response to the disaster was slow and uncoordinated, It wasn't until hours after the quake struck that any significant help came from the authorities, despite the growing number of people in need of aid. The lack of preparedness in the face of such a massive disaster left the survivors feeling abandoned, with frustration and anger mounting against the government for not acting sooner. Many people turned to neighboring regions and international organizations for help, hoping that outside assistance would provide the support the city so desperately needed. The impact on Messina's economy was equally devastating. With trade and commerce disrupted for weeks, businesses were forced to close their doors. The economic shockwaves rippled through the region, leaving many people unemployed and without basic necessities. The city's ports, which were once vital to its economy, were heavily damaged, making it nearly impossible to ship goods in or out of the region. In addition to the immediate physical damage, the emotional toll on the people of Messina was profound. Families had lost everything: homes, loved ones, and livelihoods. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, and those who survived were left to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The psychological trauma of the event would linger long after the physical damage had been repaired, leaving deep scars on the collective memory of the people of Messina. As the days passed and more survivors were pulled from the rubble, the world began to take notice of the disaster. International aid poured in from countries around the globe, offering financial assistance, medical supplies, and teams of rescue workers. The international community came together to help Messina, but the Italian government's delayed response left a lasting sense of bitterness among the survivors. The contrast between the swift actions of foreign aid organizations and the slow response of local authorities further highlighted the deficiencies in disaster preparedness and response at the time. While the devastation was undeniable, the people of Messina showed extraordinary resilience in the face of such overwhelming destruction. Despite the lack of immediate aid, the survivors banded together to support one another, forming makeshift communities and organizing efforts to clear the rubble and search for any remaining survivors. Their determination to rebuild their lives amid such a catastrophic event marked the beginning of a long recovery process, one that would take years and require the collective effort of not just Messina, but the entire country. Next, we'll explore the long road to recovery and the challenges that the survivors faced as they struggled to rebuild their city. As the days turned into weeks after the December 28th, 1908 earthquake, the people of Messina faced the daunting task of picking up the pieces of their shattered city. The scale of the destruction was so vast that rebuilding seemed almost impossible. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened, and the once thriving cityscape was now a scene of chaos and ruin. The survivors, however, showed a remarkable sense of determination. They began to organize and take action, working together to clear the rubble and rebuild their lives from scratch. In the aftermath, it was clear that Messina would need more than just physical reconstruction. It would require a complete overhaul of its infrastructure. The lack of strong building codes, which had allowed for the widespread destruction, became glaringly evident. Many of the structures that had collapsed during the earthquake were old and built without proper consideration for seismic activity. In fact, Italy had not yet developed modern, earthquake-resistant building standards, and the devastation of 1908 underscored the urgent need for change. The rebuilding process was slow and grueling. Resources were scarce, and the city's economy had been severely crippled by the disaster. Many people who had lost their homes were left without jobs, and the once bustling port of Messina was no longer functioning. Yet despite these challenges, the people of the city remained resilient. They worked together to clear the streets and rebuild their homes. Starting with makeshift shelters for those who had lost everything, one of the first priorities was to rebuild the infrastructure that had been so crucial to the city's functioning before the earthquake. Roads and bridges needed to be repaired, and the vital railway system which connected Messina to other parts of Italy had been disrupted. Rebuilding the port, which had been one of the city's main economic engines, was another top priority. Without it, Messina would struggle to recover economically. The Italian government, despite its initial slow response, began to take action in the months following the disaster. It provided some financial assistance and began to work with international organizations to help with the recovery process. However, many people still felt that the government's efforts were insufficient and that more could have been done in the immediate aftermath. The international community also continued to provide aid, and countries around the world sent resources, money, and workers to assist with the recovery. As the months passed, the survivors began to slowly rebuild their homes and businesses, but the city's landscape had been permanently altered. The once beautiful historical buildings that lined the streets of Messina were gone, and many of the city's landmarks, which had taken centuries to build, had been reduced to rubble. The loss was not just physical, it was cultural and emotional. The people of Messina were grieving for their city's past as they worked toward its future. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the earthquake also brought about important changes in Italy's approach to disaster preparedness and urban planning. In the years following the disaster, the country began to implement new laws and building codes that would better withstand future earthquakes. The lessons learned from the Messina earthquake would shape Italy's response to natural disasters for generations to come. The recovery effort also highlighted the importance of community support. In the face of overwhelming adversity, the people of Messina came together, relying on each other for help and strength. Many survivors who had lost their families and homes found solace in helping their fellow citizens rebuild. This spirit of cooperation and solidarity would become one of the defining features of Messina's recovery. In addition to physical reconstruction, there was a growing need for psychological support for the survivors. The trauma caused by the earthquake, the loss of loved ones, and the destruction of homes left many people struggling to cope with the emotional toll of the disaster. Mental health resources were scarce, and it would take time for many survivors to find a sense of normalcy. As the years passed and Messina slowly began to rise from the rubble, it became evident that the city's recovery would be a long-term process. While the physical rebuilding of homes and infrastructure took priority, the emotional and social recovery of the people was just as important. The disaster had left a deep scar on the city, and it would take generations to heal fully. However, the resilience and determination of the people of Messina ensured that the city would eventually recover and rebuild stronger than before. As we continue, we'll explore the long-term effects of the disaster on Messina's people and the city's transformation in the years following the tragedy. The earthquake of 1908, while a source of great loss, would ultimately be a turning point that reshaped the city in profound ways. The Messina earthquake of December 28, 1908 left a profound impact on the people of the city and the wider region of Sicily. The devastation was not just in the loss of lives and property, but also in the emotional and cultural toll it took on the survivors. As the years went by, the full extent of the disaster's effects on Messina and its people became clearer. The earthquake had altered the city's landscape, economy, and society in ways that would be felt for generations. One of the most significant long-term effects of the earthquake was its influence on urban planning and building regulations in Italy. Before the disaster, Italy had very few regulations in place to protect buildings from earthquakes. The collapse of entire neighborhoods during the earthquake highlighted the need for stricter building codes, particularly in earthquake-prone areas like Messina. In the aftermath, Italy made significant strides in earthquake engineering. New laws were introduced that required buildings to be designed with seismic activity in mind. These changes not only helped protect the people of Messina, but also set a precedent for earthquake-resistant construction across the country. The recovery and rebuilding efforts, although slow and arduous, brought about positive change in some areas. The Italian government and international organizations began working together to improve disaster preparedness, and in the following decades, Italy's approach to handling natural disasters became more structured. This led to the creation of better early warning systems and emergency response strategies. While these efforts came too late to save many lives in 1908, they undoubtedly saved countless others in future earthquakes, including the devastating L'Aquila earthquake of 2009. The lessons learned from Messina influenced how Italy and much of the world would approach natural disasters in the years to come. In addition to the physical and structural changes, the Messina earthquake had a profound psychological impact on the survivors. Many people who had lost loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods struggled to move forward. The trauma of the event was something that could not easily be rebuilt, and it lingered long after the rubble was cleared. Communities had to come together to help each other heal, and families had to cope with grief and loss on a scale that was unimaginable. Counseling and mental health services, while not as developed as they are today, became an essential part of the recovery process. The emotional scars left by the earthquake would take decades to heal fully, and for many, the memories of that fateful day would never be erased. For the city itself, the road to recovery was long. Despite the immense destruction, Messina began to rebuild not just its physical structures, but its identity. The historic center, which had been reduced to rubble, was slowly reconstructed and new buildings were erected with more modern and earthquake-resistant designs. In the years following the earthquake, Messina also saw new industries and economic opportunities emerge as the city adapted to its new reality. While the scars of the past remained, Messina began to find its place once again on the map of Sicily and Italy. The story of Messina's recovery and transformation is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The city, though scarred, rose from the ashes, much like its people. While the earthquake was a tragedy of immense proportions, it also served as a catalyst for change in how cities and nations prepare for natural disasters. The importance of preparedness, resilient infrastructure, and community support in times of crisis became clear, and the world took notice. The Messina earthquake of 1908 will always be remembered as one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. But beyond the tragedy and loss, it is a reminder of the strength and resilience of the people who lived through it. Their determination to rebuild, recover, and emerge stronger is an inspiring story for future generations. As we reflect on the legacy of the Messina earthquake, we are reminded that natural disasters, while often devastating, can also lead to progress and change. The lessons learned from Messina shaped Italy's approach to disaster response and preparedness, and they continue to guide efforts around the world today. The memory of Messina lives on, not just in the physical landscape, but in the spirit of the people who rebuilt their city and their lives from the ground up. With this final chapter, we conclude our exploration of the Messina earthquake, a tragedy that altered a city, a nation, and the course of history. We honor the lives lost, the survivors who endured unimaginable hardship, and the lasting impact this earthquake had on disaster preparedness worldwide. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history.